So this question that the scribe asks of Jesus, while it's asked as a test, it's sort of a part of this whole controversy between Jesus and the Pharisees, is a question that you often hear asked of politicians and candidates. There were many laws applied to many situations in life, so it was common to ask of them, as it is maybe for us, to sum it up. What's the bottom line? What's the most important thing? So that's what he's asking here. Jesus gives him not one, but two, and that's the originality of the answer. Both are quotations from the Old Testament, but it's Jesus putting them together that is significant. I always think of these two things, the love of God with all your heart and all your soul, and the love of neighbor as yourself, as like the cross. The vertical beam, which is the relationship with God, and then the horizontal beam, which is the relationship, the treatment of the neighbor, and that those two have to hold together. If you go to overemphasize either one, you sort of go astray spiritually. So an overemphasis on the vertical, on just a relationship with God, tends to fall into a pious sentimentality, a sort of spiritual feeling. And of course, up and down the ages, people have criticized that. This is the religion that Mark says was pie in the sky when you die. Last year, I read a biography of Frederick Douglass, the great freed slave, African-American orator, and abolitionist. And his last slave owner, he noted, was a devout Christian. He was an elder in his church. He rarely was to be seen without a Bible in his hand, and frequently read it. But he beat Douglass and the other slaves relentlessly. So Douglass was always, couldn't wrap his mind around how this man could be so devoted to his God and yet so indifferent to his fellow human being. And so while Douglass did become Christian, he had always a certain ambivalence and was always very suspicious of an overly pious religion that tends to substitute piety for charity. It tends to put devotion in place of compassion. On the other side, if you just emphasize the horizontal, the care for the neighbor without rooting it in love of God and spirituality, that tends to fall over into activism and even a certain messianism. It's going to save the world. And sometimes that at the extremes can fall over into anger and frustration. Many years ago, I had the chance to travel a bit in South America, and this whole debate, it was sort of known at that time between the Sacramentalists and the Liberationists, was very much in the air in the church and in society, with those the Liberationists, the followers of a theology called liberation theology, looking around and seeing the injustices and the suffering of the people, saying, if our faith is to have any significance at all, it has to address these issues. And so they devoted themselves to social change, to righting injustice. They were critical of what they called the Sacramentalists, those who devoted themselves to celebrating the sacraments. And indeed, you could go into churches in Lima and find priests saying Mass all day long at the bequest of people for special personal intentions, but indifferent to the weight of suffering around them. And so Jesus holds together and insists on the holding together of these two, the vertical, the horizontal. And maybe there are some who almost by personality fall into one or other side of that. There are some who sort of, seems to me, that by, I don't know, proclivity, tend towards the more spiritual and pious, and then there are others who tend to a more activist, social endeavor. But it can be said, I think, that over the years I've observed a lot of times that the social justice types don't tend to pray enough, and the praying types don't tend to be involved in enough social action. So, holding them together. The first thing that the answer that Jesus gives points out, of course, that at the core of the commandments is about love. What life, the purpose of life, the goal of life is not achievement or acquisition, but love. Firstly, of course, the love of God. That vertical beam has to be firmly in place. And how do we love God? Well, not in this passage, but elsewhere in the Bible insists on worship. What we owe to God in love is worship. Worship orders us to God. It orders us beyond the self. Worship reminds us of our proper posture, which is that we are not, it decenters us. We are not the center of the world. Dethrones us. God is the center. God is, or should be, on the throne. We are what we worship. What we worship is what we put our attention on, what we trust in, what we're dedicated to, committed to. I suppose one way to think about it is, if you find yourself with time in your hands, you have to wait somewhere, what does your mind go to? So, Jesus says the love of God has to be first, not third or fourth. It's easy for us to love God, but in third or fourth place. If something else is in the center, success or fame or pleasure or money or whatever, then that's an idol. That's an idol. And the Bible always warned against idolatry, the worshiping of something other than God. And the other way, of course, is the one that's picked up in the gospel today, is that we cannot say that we love the God we do not see if we do not love the neighbor whom we do see. That the sort of testing of our love of God is in our relationship with the other. The relationship with God leads us to the other, and a proper understanding of the other, like ourselves, as broken and blessed, created by God, sinful, damaged, but redeemed. The first reading gives us practical applications of that love of the neighbor in three areas. Firstly, it talks about the option for the most vulnerable. It says, do not molest or oppress the alien, the stranger in your midst. And it's not just a call to a moral doing good. It's a call to empathy. Why? Remember that you were once aliens in the land of Egypt. Right? It is a call to a fellow feeling, a compassion, an identification with the alien, which of course is good for us, because here pretty much everybody has a stranger story. Pretty much everybody came from somewhere else, or their ancestors did, from Ireland or Italy or Mexico or wherever. Remember that you were once aliens in the land of Egypt. So, in the Old Testament, as we know, the great categories for the weak, the poor, the vulnerable were the stranger, the widow, and the orphan. Why? Because they had no land. Land was wealth. Land was what sustained. And so they were without protection, vulnerable. Now, it is sort of a first principle of Old Testament spirituality that the measure of the faith of the people is the quality of justice in the land. And the quality of justice in the land is measured by how the poor and the vulnerable are treated. Let me say that again, because it is such a contrast to the world of that time, which worshipped power and domination. Indeed, maybe always. The measure of the faith of the people, of their fidelity to the covenant, was the quality of justice in the land. And the quality of justice in the land was measured by the treatment of the most vulnerable, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. So the Bible has this bias to the bottom, not to the top. Now that is whenever you see that, you can hear and see a biblical spirituality. At the beginning of the modern age, there was a shift away from that. Might mention the philosopher Nietzsche in Europe, who declared God is dead and rejected Christianity as being a religion of the weak and of the meek. And so he talked about a will to power and a Superman. This is part of the philosophical thinking that moved into Nazism and Hitler and so on, with the disastrous consequences. Hitler said explicitly, we're a great people, but we have the wrong religion. We have a religion that exalts meekness and upholds the weak. Whenever a society, whenever a people neglects its most vulnerable members, disaster follows. And so in our time, at that time it was the stranger, the widow, the orphan. In our time it's still the stranger. The refugees, displaced people is still one of the awful realities of our world, and how they are welcomed and treated is one of the great measures and challenges. But maybe also it would be among the other most vulnerable are the unborn, and at the other end of life, the old and infirm. See where the effects of the virus has most heavily fallen on people. A society that neglects its weakest members and begins to celebrate power and perfection will soon create great problems. So that's the bias towards the poor, the option for the most vulnerable. The next one, of course, in terms of the practical living out of love of neighbor as ourselves, is our use of money. So the first reading says, if you lend money, do not extort, do not, there it says, do not charge interest, usury. So this is, of course, saying that the neighbor is not a profit center for us, especially the weak neighbor. It's not a means just for us to make profit. There has to be a sense of the common good. And then, lastly, the third one has to do with property. If you have your neighbor's cloak as collateral, as a pledge, you have to give it back to him. So, from the prophets of Israel to Pope Francis in his latest encyclical, defend the right of private property, of course, but not absolutely. There is such a thing as the universal destination of goods. The goods of the earth that the Lord creates for all God's people. not for the excess of a few and the impoverishment of many. So, three areas that the reading points out. The bias to the bottom, we would say, to those on the fringes. The use of money to keeping the neighbor in our circle of concern and of a private property. So, holding together the love of God and the love of neighbor, making one the practical living out of the other, making the love of God the engine, the source, the driving force behind our love of neighbor is what is involved in Jesus' answer. St. Teresa of Avila has a prayer that I think brings this together quite well. Many of you have heard it before. Oops, this will require glasses. Christ has no body but yours, no hands, no feet on earth but yours. Yours are the eyes with which he looks compassion on this world. Yours are the feet with which he walks to do good. Yours are the hands with which he blesses all the world. Yours are the hands, yours are the feet. Yours are the eyes, you are his body. Christ has no body now but yours, no hands, no feet on earth but yours. Yours are the eyes with which he looks compassion on this world. Christ has no body now on earth but yours.